It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life. The kind of day you dream about since you were a little girl, playing dress-up and imagining yourself as a bride. I woke up early, the sun peeking through the curtains of my childhood bedroom in the old farmhouse where I grew up. Outside, the air smelled fresh, like grass and wildflowers, and everything felt perfect. Our family's land stretched out for acres. Rolling hills, tall trees, and that big red barn we'd turned into a rustic wedding venue. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. My parents had worked hard to keep this place intact, passing it down to me with the promise that it would always stay in the family. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my veil, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just any wedding. It was a celebration of love and legacy. Every detail, the flowers strung across the fence posts, the string lights twinkling between the trees, even the hand-painted signs pointing guests to their seats, was meant to honor the land that had been part of my family for generations. It was personal, intimate, and deeply meaningful. But then, just as I stepped outside to take one last look at the setup before putting on my dress, I saw them. Two men in khaki uniforms, standing near the entrance of the property. Their hats were pulled low, and they carried clipboards like they owned the place. One of them held up a hand when he noticed me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not exactly friendly, "we need to talk." I froze. Talk? About what? My heart started pounding as I walked toward them, trying to stay calm. "Is there a problem?" I asked, forcing a polite tone. The taller one flipped open his clipboard and began reading from a piece of paper. "We've received reports of multiple violations regarding your event here today. Specifically, unauthorized gathering permits, noise level concerns, and improper signage." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Violations? On my land? This is private property," I stammered, shaking my head. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" The shorter officer crossed his arms, looking impatient. "Private or not, these are Willow Creek HOA regulations. If you wanted to host an event, you needed approval first." Approval? From the HOA. I almost laughed. It sounded ridiculous, but their expressions told me they weren't joking. Panic bubbled inside me as I tried to explain. "This isn't part of the HOA jurisdiction," I insisted. "This land has been in my family for over 100 years. You can't just come here and tell me what to do." They didn't listen. Instead, the taller one reached for his radio, saying something about needing backup. Before I could protest further, the second officer grabbed my arm. Not roughly, but firmly enough to make it clear I wasn't going anywhere. "You'll have to sort this out downtown," he said. Downtown. I glanced back toward the barn, where guests were starting to arrive. My fiancé, Ethan, stood near the altar, adjusting his tie, completely unaware of what was happening. Tears pricked my eyes as I shouted, "This is my wedding day. You can't arrest me on my wedding day." But they did. As they led me away, I caught glimpses of shocked faces, friends, family, strangers, all staring in disbelief. Some whispered, others filmed the scene on their phones. And there I was, wearing my wedding gown, being shoved into the back of a truck while my perfect day unraveled around me. The ride to the station, or whatever makeshift office the HOA used as their headquarters, felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I sat in the back seat of their truck, my hands cuffed in front of me, staring out the window at the blur of trees and fields passing by. My wedding gown, once pristine and full of promise, now felt heavy and suffocating. The delicate lace sleeves caught on the rough edge of the seatbelt, and every bump in the road seemed to mock me. How could this be happening? On my wedding day, no less. When we arrived, they led me inside without a word. The station turned out to be a small room tucked into the corner of the HOA clubhouse, a place I'd never paid much attention to before, but now loathed with every fiber of my being. A young woman sat behind a desk, typing furiously on her computer, barely glancing up as they brought me in. She didn't look old enough to legally drink, let alone enforce rules that had somehow ruined my life in under an hour. They sat me down in a hard plastic chair, the kind you'd find in a school cafeteria or a doctor's waiting room. One of the officers hovered nearby, clipboard still in hand, while the other paced back and forth like he was trying to intimidate me. It worked, at least for a moment. My heart raced, and my palms were slick with sweat despite the cool air conditioning. But then something shifted inside me. Anger began to replace fear. "This is ridiculous," I said, glaring at them. "You can't just arrest someone on their own property." The taller officer stopped pacing and turned to face me. His expression was smug, almost amused, like he thought I was cute for even trying to argue. "Ma'am, these are the rules. You broke them. That's all there is to it. But this isn't your jurisdiction." I shot back, my voice rising. "This land has been in my family for generations. Generations. Do you even know who owns this county?" That got their attention. Both men exchanged uneasy glances, and the receptionist paused her typing mid-stroke. For a second, no one said anything. Then the shorter one cleared his throat and asked, "What do you mean? Who owns this county?" I leaned forward, my anger giving me courage. "I mean exactly what I said. My family owns half the mineral rights to Willow Creek County, including the land your precious clubhouse sits on. So maybe you should think twice before dragging people off to some fake jail cell." Their faces went pale. The taller officer opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it again, clearly unsure of what to say. The receptionist frantically started clicking through files on her computer, probably searching for proof that I was bluffing. But I wasn't. I pulled out my phone. It was still in my pocket, thank goodness, and scrolled to a saved email from my lawyer. It detailed everything. The deeds, the rights, the history. When I turned the screen toward them, their jaws dropped. "You're bluffing," the shorter officer muttered, though his voice wavered. "Am I?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Call my lawyer if you don't believe me. Or better yet, call Mr. Grayson. I'm sure he'll have plenty to say about this." At the mention of Mr. Grayson, the head of the HOA, their expressions changed completely. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by nervous uncertainty. They whispered to each other, shooting furtive glances my way. Whatever power they thought they had over me was crumbling right before their eyes. Finally, the taller one sighed and uncrossed his arms. "Look, maybe we should clarify things with Mr. Grayson first." "Oh, trust me," I said, leaning back in my chair, a small smile creeping onto my face. "You absolutely should." For the first time since they'd shown up at my wedding, I felt a flicker of hope. These men weren't untouchable authority figures. They were just pawns in a game I suddenly knew how to play, and I was done letting them win. It didn't take long for word to spread. Within minutes of my little showdown with the HOA officers, Mr. Grayson himself arrived at the station, or rather, his office. He burst through the door like a storm cloud, his usual polished demeanor replaced by something closer to panic. His tie was slightly askew, and his face was flushed, as if he'd been rushing to get here. For once, he didn't look like the untouchable leader of Willow Creek's Homeowners Association. He looked like a man who had just realized he might have made a huge mistake. "Ms. Harper," he began, his voice tight and clipped, "there seems to be a misunderstanding." I almost laughed. A misunderstanding. That was rich. I crossed my arms, leaning back in my chair, making sure he could see the handcuffs still around my wrists. "Oh, really?" I said, letting sarcasm drip from every word. "Because last I checked, arresting someone on their wedding day isn't exactly a misunderstanding. It's more like assault." His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly recovered, clearing his throat. "Yes, well, we weren't aware of the full extent of your ownership," he stammered, glancing nervously at the two officers standing nearby. They looked like they wanted to disappear into the floorboards. "Had we known—" "Oh, spare me the excuses," I interrupted. cutting him off before he could finish. My patience was gone, burned away by hours of frustration and humiliation. You knew exactly what you were doing. You came onto my property, disrupted my wedding, and arrested me, all because I didn't grovel for permission to use land that's been in my family for over a century. Don't act like this is some kind of honest mistake. He winced, clearly uncomfortable under my glare. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. So here's how this is going to work, I continued, sitting up straighter. First, you're going to drop all charges against me right now. Second, you're going to issue a public apology, not just to me, but to everyone who saw what happened today. And third, I paused for effect, letting the weight of my next words sink in. You're going to dissolve the HOA within 30 days. The room went silent. Even the receptionist stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Mr. Grayson stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he managed to sputter. That's impossible. The HOA provides essential services to the community. Essential services? I shot back, raising an eyebrow. Like harassing people. Like bullying them into compliance with rules no one asked for. Face it, Mr. Grayson. You've been running this place like your own personal kingdom. And everyone knows it. If you don't agree to my terms, I'll make sure every single homeowner in Willow Creek finds out exactly who's been profiting off their fees and whose land you've been squatting on. His face turned pale. That's blackmail, he whispered, though it sounded more like a plea than an accusation. No, I corrected him, leaning forward until our faces were inches apart. That's leverage, and trust me, you don't want to test me on this. For a moment, nobody moved. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then finally, Mr. Grayson sighed, defeated. He nodded slowly, avoiding eye contact. Fine, he muttered. We'll do as you say. I felt a rush of triumph, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I stood up, brushing imaginary dust off my dress. Good choice, I said coolly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a wedding to finish. As I walked out of the office, flanked by stunned silence, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just about winning. It was about proving a point. These people thought they were untouchable, that their rules mattered more than anything else. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. And now, thanks to me, they were about to learn exactly who really held the power in Willow Creek. By the time I returned to the wedding site, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. News of my arrest, and the reason behind it, had spread like wildfire among the guests. People were buzzing with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. When I stepped out of the car, still wearing my wedding gown, but now with a look of quiet determination on my face, the crowd erupted into applause. Friends and family rushed toward me, hugging me tightly and peppering me with questions. Are you okay? Ethan asked first, his voice trembling with emotion as he pulled me into his arms. His suit jacket was slightly wrinkled, and his tie hung loose around his neck, evidence of how frantic he'd been during my absence. I nodded, blinking back tears. I'm fine, I assured him, though my voice cracked slightly. Better than fine, actually. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. With the help of my maid of honor and a few close friends, I cleaned up and freshened my makeup. Someone brought me a cup of tea to calm my nerves, while another handed me a snack to settle my stomach. Despite everything that had happened, there was an undeniable sense of unity in the air. My loved ones weren't just supporting me. They were rallying behind me, ready to stand by my side no matter what came next. When I finally walked down the aisle again, this time without interruption, I felt stronger than ever. The same archway of flowers framed the altar where Ethan waited for me, his eyes filled with admiration and relief. As I took my place beside him, I turned to address the crowd before the ceremony officially resumed. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions whirling inside me. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today, not just for the wedding, but for standing with me through what happened earlier. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, and I paused to let it sink in. I know some of you might be wondering why the HOA thought they could come onto my family's land and arrest me on my wedding day. I continued, letting my tone harden slightly. Well, here's the truth. They didn't realize who they were dealing with. This land has been in my family for generations. And guess what? We own half the mineral rights to this county, including the lot their clubhouse sits on. Gasps echoed through the crowd, followed by cheers and laughter. Some people clapped so loudly that Ethan had to lean in to whisper, "You're stealing your own spotlight, you know." I grinned at him before turning back to the guests. But here's the thing. None of us should have to live under rules that don't make sense or leaders who abuse their power. So, starting today, the HOA is dissolving. No more unfair fines, no more ridiculous restrictions, just freedom for all of us. The applause was deafening. Strangers hugged me, thanking me for standing up to the bullies who'd controlled their lives for so long. Even Mrs. Hargrove, the queen of conformity, approached me after the ceremony with a reluctant smile. "You really showed them," she admitted, her voice softer than usual. "Good job." As the reception kicked off, the mood transformed from tense to celebratory. Music played, laughter echoed across the fields, and plates of food were passed around freely. It wasn't just a wedding anymore, it was a victory party. People danced under the string lights, shared stories about run-ins with the HOA, and toasted to a future free from unnecessary rules. Standing there, surrounded by love and joy, I realized something profound. Sometimes, life throws challenges your way not to break you, but to remind you of your strength. Today, I hadn't just married the love of my life. I'd also reclaimed my power. And as I looked out at the happy faces of my friends, family, and neighbors, I knew we created something truly special together. The days following the wedding were a whirlwind of attention and change. Word of what had happened spread far beyond Willow Creek, thanks to social media and local news outlets eager to cover the dramatic story. Headlines like "Bride Takes Down HOA on Her Wedding Day" and "Willow Creek Residents Celebrate Freedom from Overbearing Rules" dominated feeds, turning my personal victory into something much bigger. Friends tagged me in memes, strangers sent messages of support, and hashtags like #BrideEVsHOA trended for days. At first, I felt overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight, but then I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for fairness, no matter how intimidating the opposition might seem. Back in Willow Creek, the ripple effects of my confrontation with the HOA became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out now knocked on my door daily, thanking me for exposing the truth. Some shared their own horror stories, fines for planting flowers that were too colorful, threats over holiday decorations left up past arbitrary deadlines, even demands to repaint mailboxes because they didn't match some invisible standard. The more I listened, the angrier I got, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been silenced by fear or bureaucracy. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch sipping tea, Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the end of the driveway. She hesitated before approaching, her usual air of superiority replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. "Can we talk?" she asked, twisting her hands nervously. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, she sighed. "I owe you an apology," she admitted, avoiding eye contact. "I've always believed the rules were there for a reason. To keep things orderly, you know. But after everything that happened, well, maybe order isn't worth losing our freedom over." Her words caught me off guard. Of all people, I never expected Mrs. Hargrove to admit she was wrong. Yet here she was, humbled and honest. "It's okay," I said gently. "We're all figuring things out as we go. The important thing is that we learn from this." She smiled faintly, nodding. "Still, thank you for everything. You've given us all a chance to start fresh." As word of the HOA's dissolution spread, people began reclaiming their properties in ways that made Willow Creek feel alive again. Brightly painted fences popped up where dull beige ones used to stand. Gardens overflowed with wildflowers instead of perfectly trimmed hedges. Kids played outside without worrying about noise complaints, and families hosted barbecues without needing permits. It was chaos, sure, but it was beautiful chaos. The kind that reminded everyone why they fell in love with this place in the first place. Even Mr. Grayson made an appearance one evening, though not uninvited. He knocked on the farmhouse door, looking smaller somehow, his usual confidence stripped away. "Miss Harper," he began awkwardly, "I wanted to apologize personally. What happened? It shouldn't have. I let things get out of hand." I studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. Finally, I nodded. "Apology accepted," I said simply. "But remember this, power isn't about control. It's about serving the community. Don't forget that." He left shortly after, visibly shaken but seemingly determined to do better. Whether he meant it or not, I couldn't say. But his visit marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where accountability mattered more than authority. By the end of the week, life in Willow Creek felt lighter, freer. People waved to each other more often, lingered longer at the mailbox to chat, and worked together to solve problems instead of relying on outdated rules. And while I knew challenges would still arise, I also knew we'd face them as a united front. After all, we weren't just neighbors. We were a community, one that refused to be ruled by fear or greed ever again. Months later, the transformation in Willow Creek was undeniable. The once stifling grip of the HOA had loosened into something entirely different, a spirit of cooperation and creativity that seemed to breathe new life into every corner of the community. Where there used to be rigid rules and whispered complaints, there was now laughter, collaboration, and a sense of ownership that extended far beyond property lines. It wasn't perfect, no community ever is, but it was real. And that made all the difference. Ethan and I decided to host a community picnic on our land one crisp autumn afternoon, partly as a thank you to everyone who'd supported us through the chaos of the wedding, and partly because we wanted to celebrate how far we'd come. We invited neighbors from near and far, encouraging them to bring dishes to share, games to play, and stories to tell. By noon, the fields were alive with activity. Kids chased each other through piles of leaves. Couples strolled hand in hand along the trails, and the smell of homemade chili and apple pie wafted through the air. Music played softly from a portable speaker, blending with the hum of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. As I stood under the same archway where my wedding ceremony had taken place, watching the scene unfold before me, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. This land wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who cared enough to fight for it. People wandered freely, admiring the wildflowers, climbing trees, and even taking selfies in front of the barn. The contrast between this day and the tense, controlled atmosphere imposed by the HOA was striking. Back then, people tiptoed around regulations, afraid of stepping out of line. Now, they'd moved with ease, unburdened by fear or judgment. Mrs. Hargrove approached me midway through the event, carrying a plate piled high with food. "This is amazing," she said, gesturing toward the crowd. "I haven't seen Willow Creek this lively in years." "Thanks," I replied, smiling. "It's nice to see everyone enjoying themselves without worrying about breaking some silly rule." She chuckled, shaking her head. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but maybe a little disorder is good for the soul." We shared a laugh, and for the first time, I felt like we truly understood each other. Mrs. Hargrove wasn't the villain I'd once imagined her to be. She was just someone who'd been caught up in a system she didn't fully question until it was too late. Watching her mingle with others, chatting and laughing like she'd always belonged here, reminded me that change isn't about pointing fingers. It's about finding common ground. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan pulled me aside. "Can you believe how far we've come?" he asked, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "I can," I said, leaning into him. "But honestly, I think this is just the beginning." He raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I hesitated for a moment, choosing my words carefully. I mean, if we can take down an entire HOA, imagine what else we can accomplish. Maybe it's time to start thinking bigger, like helping other communities break free from systems that don't serve them. Ethan grinned. You're unstoppable. You know that. Not unstoppable, I corrected him. Just determined. As fireworks lit up the night sky, a surprise arranged by some of our friends, the crowd erupted into cheers. Standing there, surrounded by people who had become more than just neighbors, I realized something profound. Fighting for what's right isn't just about winning battles. It's about building connections, fostering trust, and creating spaces where everyone feels valued and heard. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that, more than anything, was worth celebrating. As the months turned into a year, Willow Creek continued to evolve in ways I could never have imagined. The absence of the HOA didn't lead to chaos, as some had feared. It led to freedom. People took ownership of their homes and their community in ways that felt authentic and meaningful. Neighbors worked together to repaint the playground equipment at the park, organize weekend farmers markets, and even build a small library box near the entrance of the neighborhood. There was no rule book dictating what they could or couldn't do. Instead, there was trust, creativity, and a shared desire to make things better. For me, life settled into a rhythm that felt both peaceful and fulfilling. Ethan and I spent our weekends exploring the trails on our property, hosting barbecues for friends, and occasionally helping neighbors with projects around their homes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and that's what made it special. Every morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch and watched the sunrise over the hills, I felt grateful, not just for the land itself, but for the way it brought people together. One crisp spring morning, I received an email from a woman named Clara who lived in a neighboring town. She explained that her community was struggling under the weight of a similarly overbearing HOA and asked if I'd be willing to share my story at a town hall meeting they were organizing. At first, I hesitated. The thought of reliving the drama of that day still made my stomach churn. But then I remembered how isolated I'd felt before standing up to the HOA, and how much it meant to know someone else had your back. I'll do it, I replied, typing out the words quickly before I could second-guess myself. The night of the meeting, I stood nervously at the front of a packed room, clutching a glass of water. Faces stared back at me, some hopeful, others skeptical, but all listening intently. As I recounted the events leading up to my arrest, the confrontation with Mr. Grayson, and the eventual dissolution of the HOA, I saw nods of understanding ripple through the crowd. When I finished speaking, the room erupted into applause, followed by a flood of questions. By the end of the evening, several residents approached me, thanking me for giving them the courage to challenge their own leadership. That experience marked the beginning of something bigger than I had anticipated. Over the next few months, I started receiving invitations to speak at other community meetings, write guest articles for local newspapers, and even consult with neighborhoods looking to restructure their governance models. What began as a personal battle had transformed into a movement, a quiet revolution fueled by ordinary people determined to reclaim their power. Back home, Willow Creek thrived. The annual Harvest Festival became a beloved tradition, drawing visitors from nearby towns. Kids raced each other in sack races, while parents sampled homemade jams and pies. Even Mrs. Hargrove got involved, chairing the decorating committee and earning praise for her creative use of pumpkins and cornstalks. Watching her laugh alongside neighbors she'd once intimidated filled me with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. On the anniversary of my wedding, Ethan and I hosted another gathering on the property. This time, it wasn't just about us. It was about celebrating everything we'd built together. As fireworks lit up the sky and music played softly in the background, I looked around at the faces of friends, family, and neighbors who had become like extended kin. Standing there, hand in hand with Ethan, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that grow organically from moments of courage and connection. My fight against the HOA hadn't just changed Willow Creek, it had changed me. And in doing so, it reminded me of the power of standing up for what's right. Not because it's easy, but because it matters. Life isn't perfect, and neither is Willow Creek. But as long as we continue to choose kindness over control, collaboration over conflict, and freedom over fear, I know we'll keep moving in the right direction. Because at the end of the day, communities aren't defined by their rules. They're defined by the people who call them home. And ours was pretty darn good.